There is a moment in every air battle when physics stops being theory and becomes the difference between life and death. And in the skies over occupied Europe during the Second World War, one group of fighter pilots discovered a rule so deceptively simple that it changed the way aerial combat was fought over the Western Front. It was not a complicated maneuver. It was not a secret weapon. It was a dive, a steep, full-throttle, committed dive toward the Earth. And the men who flew the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt learned that when they followed this rule, something remarkable happened. The German Focke-Wulf 190 pilots who chased them into that dive did not come back up. They vanished. Not because of luck, not because of superior numbers, because of physics, engineering, and one of the most underestimated advantages in aviation history. To understand why this worked, you need to understand what the P-47 Thunderbolt actually was. Most fighters of the Second World War were designed to be light, nimble, and fast in a turn. The P-47 was none of those things. It was enormous. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war, weighing in at over 7 tons fully loaded. Pilots who transitioned from smaller aircraft described climbing into the cockpit as feeling like strapping into a freight train with wings. The radial engine up front, the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, produced over 2,000 horsepower and drank fuel at a rate that demanded an internal capacity of over 300 gallons. Everything about this aircraft was oversized. The propeller was over 12 feet in diameter. The fuselage was so wide that early pilots joked they could dodge enemy fire simply by leaning to one side inside the cockpit. And yet, despite its bulk, despite the jokes, despite the initial skepticism from pilots who had grown accustomed to lighter machines, the P-47 possessed a quality that no other Allied fighter could match at that stage of the war. It could dive faster, longer, and more controllably than anything else in the sky. And it was this quality, born from its sheer mass and its turbo-supercharged engine, that would become the foundation of a tactic so effective, it rewrote the rules of engagement over Western Europe. The story of how this tactic emerged begins not in a briefing room, but in the hard lessons learned during the first combat sorties flown by units equipped with the Thunderbolt. When the P-47 first entered combat in the spring of 1943, its pilots faced an immediate and sobering reality. If you are finding this story fascinating, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this one to you, and it means more than you might think. The Focke-Wulf 190, by that point in the war, had established itself as one of the most dangerous fighters in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. It was fast, it was responsive, and its pilots were experienced veterans who had been fighting over Europe for years. In a turning fight at medium altitudes, the FW-190 was a lethal opponent. Its roll rate was outstanding, allowing its pilots to reverse direction with a snap that left heavier aircraft struggling to follow. Its armament was devastating, a combination of machine guns and cannons that could shred a bomber or cripple a fighter in a single well-aimed burst. And critically, the pilots who flew it understood its strengths intimately. They fought in pairs and in fours, using coordinated slashing attacks that exploited speed and surprise rather than prolonged turning engagements. For the P-47 pilots arriving in theater, the initial encounters were humbling. Attempting to turn with an FW-190 at 15 or 18,000 feet was an exercise in frustration. The Thunderbolt was simply too heavy, its turn radius too wide, its energy bleed in a sustained turn too severe. Reports from early missions documented the problem clearly. Pilots described feeling outmatched in horizontal maneuvering, unable to bring their guns to bear against opponents who could reverse and reposition with apparent ease. Some early encounters resulted in losses that shook confidence in the new aircraft. But amid those difficult early engagements, something else was being noticed, something that would change everything. Pilots who found themselves in trouble, bounced from above, outnumbered or caught at a disadvantage, discovered that when they pushed the nose down and dove, something unexpected happened. The P-47 accelerated in the dive with a ferocity that seemed almost impossible for an aircraft its size. The massive weight that was a liability in a turn became a tremendous asset pointed toward the Earth. Gravity and 7 tons of aircraft combined to produce acceleration that left pursuing fighters behind, as though they had hit an invisible wall. And the FW-190 pilots who followed them into those dives encountered a problem they could not solve. As speed built past 400 miles per hour, then past 450, the Focke-Wulf's controls began to stiffen. The ailerons grew heavy. The elevator required increasing force. At speeds approaching 500 miles per hour in a dive, according to documented accounts and post-war analysis, the FW-190 entered a regime of compressibility effects that made the aircraft increasingly difficult to control. The air flowing over the wing surfaces began to behave differently at these transonic speeds, creating shock waves that disrupted the normal aerodynamic forces on the control surfaces. For a pilot already committed to following a diving P-47, this was not merely uncomfortable, it was potentially fatal. Pulling out of such a dive required enormous physical strength on the controls, and the margin between a successful recovery and an uncontrollable plunge into the ground shrank with every additional knot of airspeed. The P-47, by contrast, handled these speeds with remarkable composure. Its controls remained responsive deeper into the speed envelope than almost any contemporary fighter. The broad, thick wing that made it less agile in a turn provided stability at extreme dive speeds. The turbo-supercharged engine, which compressed incoming air through an elaborate system of ducting that ran the length of the fuselage, maintained power delivery even as altitude dropped rapidly, and the sheer structural strength of the airframe, built to withstand the stresses of its own enormous weight, meant that the Thunderbolt could sustain dive speeds and pull out forces that would have overstressed lighter designs. What emerged from these observations was not just a defensive maneuver, it became an offensive doctrine. Experienced squadron leaders began teaching a principle that was elegant in its simplicity. Gain altitude. Always fight from above. When you engage, dive through the enemy formation with maximum speed. Use your .850 caliber machine guns in a brief, devastating pass, and then continue the dive to extend away and reset for another attack. Do not slow down. Do not turn to follow. Do not allow the engagement to devolve into a turning fight where the enemy's advantages come into play. Dive, shoot, extend, climb, repeat. This was the essence of what became known broadly as energy fighting, and the P-47 was perhaps its purest expression during this period of the war. The tactic was not born in a laboratory. It was forged in combat by pilots who learned, sometimes at terrible cost, what their aircraft could and could not do. And once it was understood, once the dive rule was internalized across fighter groups flying the Thunderbolt, the dynamic of air combat over Western Europe began to shift. The German pilots recognized the problem, but found no adequate solution. If an FW-190 pilot refused to follow a diving P-47, the American escaped and would return with altitude advantage. If the German followed the dive, he entered a speed regime where his aircraft became progressively harder to control, while the Thunderbolt ahead of him remained stable and continued to pull away. Analysis of combat reports from this period shows a pattern. FW-190 pilots who committed to pursuing diving Thunderbolts at extreme speeds experienced control difficulties, structural warnings, and in documented cases, fatal loss of control during attempted recovery from the dive. The phrase that gives this video its title, "They vanished," was not poetic license among the American pilots who reported it. Aircraft that followed them into those dives simply did not reappear. They were found later, or they were not found at all, but they did not return to the fight. The tactic also exploited a psychological dimension that is often overlooked in technical analysis. A pilot in a diving P-47, following a practiced and understood procedure, experienced the situation with a measure of control and confidence. The aircraft was doing what it was built to do. The speed, while extreme, was within known parameters. The recovery procedure was trained and practiced. For the pursuing FW-190 pilot, the experience was fundamentally different. Each second in the dive took him further into an unfamiliar and increasingly dangerous flight regime. His controls fought him. His aircraft vibrated and buffeted in ways that signaled approaching structural or aerodynamic limits, and every moment of hesitation about whether to continue the pursuit or break off was a moment in which airspeed continued to build, making the eventual recovery more difficult and more dangerous. The decision to follow a diving Thunderbolt was, in effect, a decision to enter a contest that the FW-190 was engineered to lose. This understanding spread through the fighter groups with the urgency that only combat experience can provide. Veteran pilots passed it to replacements. Briefing rooms echoed with the same fundamental instruction. Trust the dive. Do not try to be what this aircraft is not. Use its weight. Use its speed. Use the fact that no single-engine fighter in the German inventory could follow you down and come back up intact at the speeds the Thunderbolt could sustain. It is worth pausing to consider what this looked like from the ground. Anti-aircraft crews, resistance fighters hiding in farmhouses, and civilians who watched the air battles unfold above them described a recurring sight. A large, barrel-shaped fighter would appear high above, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs or fours. Then it would tip over and plunge earthward at an angle that seemed impossibly steep, the howl of its engine rising to a scream that shook windows and rattled roof tiles. Behind it, smaller, sleeker shapes would follow, the angular silhouette of the F-190 unmistakable even from the ground. And then, while the big fighter would level out and roar away at treetop height before climbing again, the pursuing shapes would not always reappear. Sometimes there would be a distant column of smoke rising from a field or a wooded hillside. Sometimes there was nothing at all, just the sudden absence of an aircraft that had been there moments before. The engineering reasons behind this disparity deserve closer examination. The FW-190's radial engine, the BMW 801, was a superb power plant, but the aircraft's wing loading and control surface design created specific vulnerabilities at extreme speeds. As the FW-190 accelerated beyond its optimal speed range in a dive, the air flowing over its relatively thin wing sections approached the speed of sound locally, even though the aircraft as a whole was still well below that threshold. These localized supersonic flows created shock waves on the wing surface, a phenomenon known as compressibility, that disrupted the smooth airflow over the ailerons and elevator. The practical effect was that a pilot pulling back on the stick at 480 miles per hour might find that the aircraft responded sluggishly or not at all. Some accounts describe pilots bracing both hands on the stick and pulling with every ounce of strength, only to feel the nose continue to track downward as the ground filled the windscreen. The P-47's wing, by contrast, was thicker in cross-section relative to its chord. This might seem counterintuitive. A thicker wing should theoretically encounter compressibility problems sooner. But the specific airfoil profiles used, combined with the wing's greater area and the overall mass of the aircraft, meant that the Thunderbolt maintained laminar flow over its control surfaces to higher indicated airspeeds. The result was that a P-47 pilot in the same dive, at the same speed, still had functional ailerons and an elevator that responded to input. The aircraft was heavy on the controls, certainly, but it was controllable. That distinction, between heavy but functional and heavy and unresponsive, was the gap between life and death. The effectiveness of this approach was reflected in the operational record. Units flying the P-47 compiled impressive tallies not by outturning their opponents, but by refusing to play the opponent's game. They fought vertically in a war where most pilots had been trained to think horizontally. They used gravity as an ally rather than viewing their weight as a burden, and they transformed what many had initially seen as the P-47's greatest weakness, its massive, lumbering bulk, into its most decisive tactical advantage. There is a broader lesson embedded in this history that extends well beyond the specific aircraft and the specific war. The P-47's dive tactics succeeded because the pilots who developed it were willing to abandon conventional thinking about what a fighter aircraft should do. They did not waste energy and lives trying to make their machine perform like a Spitfire or an FW-190. They studied what it actually was, identified the specific conditions under which it held an absolute advantage, and then built their entire combat approach around creating those conditions in every engagement. The dive rule was not a trick. It was a philosophy. It said, understand your strengths with ruthless honesty, engineer every situation to play to those strengths, and let the enemy destroy himself by trying to compete in a domain where physics is against him. The men who flew the Thunderbolt over France and Germany carried this understanding into every mission. They climbed to altitude with patience, knowing that every 1,000 feet gained was energy stored for the decisive moment. They watched for the enemy below, positioned themselves with the sun behind them when possible, and when the moment came, they pushed forward on the stick and let 7 tons of American engineering do what it did best. The FW-190 pilots who saw them coming had a choice, and neither option was good. Turn and evade, conceding the initiative and the altitude, or follow the dive, entering a contest that grew more dangerous with every passing second, chasing an aircraft that was pulling away, flying an airplane whose controls were growing heavier by the heartbeat, gambling that they could match the Thunderbolt's dive and still recover before the ground arrived. According to reports compiled after the war, many who made that gamble lost. The forests and fields below told the story in wreckage that bore the marks not of gunfire, but of impact at speeds that exceeded the structural and aerodynamic limits of the pursuing aircraft. They had followed, they had committed, and they had vanished. The P-47 Thunderbolt went on to become one of the most produced American fighters of the war, with over 15,000 built. It served in every theater, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the islands of the Pacific. Its pilots scored thousands of aerial victories and destroyed countless ground targets in the fighter-bomber role, where its ruggedness and payload capacity made it equally formidable. But among all its accomplishments, perhaps none is as instructive as this simple tactical truth discovered in the skies over occupied Europe. A truth that turned weight into speed, speed into survival, and survival into dominance. An innocent rule about diving that made the enemy follow, and then made them disappear.